The Montana wilderness in February was a study in absolute cold. Grayson Gray Mitchell stood on the porch of his remote cabin outside Whitefish, watching his breath crystallize in air that measured -18 degrees. At 37, he looked older, the kind of weathering that came from carrying guilt heavier than any rucksack he'd humped through hostile territory. 3 years ago, Gray had been one of the best. Navy SEAL, assault team leader, 16 years of operational experience across 4 continents. Then came the hostage rescue in Yemen, a compound breach that should have been textbook but became nightmare when insurgents used children as shields. Gray had taken the shot that neutralized the threat, but the round had over-penetrated and a 7-year-old boy had died in the crossfire. The investigation cleared him. Rules of engagement were followed. Hostile used human shields. Split-second decision. Acceptable losses in context of mission success. Gray had received the words like bullets, each one technically accurate, all of them unbearable. He'd left the teams 6 months later, unable to function in spaces where children's laughter reminded him of that boy's final scream. The remote cabin outside Whitefish offered isolation from people, from noise, from the constant reminder that he'd saved 14 hostages by killing 1 child. His only companion was Kodiak, an 8-year-old German shepherd who'd been Gray's patrol partner during that same Yemen mission. The explosion that had preceded the breach, a wall charge detonating too close, had left Kodiak with permanent hearing loss. The dog couldn't hear verbal commands anymore, couldn't detect approaching threats through sound, couldn't perform the work he'd been bred and trained for. Military veterinarians had recommended euthanasia. Gray had driven 18 hours to the kennel and signed adoption papers instead. If the Navy was done with both of them, at least they'd be done together. Gray worked as a wilderness survival instructor now, teaching corporate groups and outdoor enthusiasts how to build shelter, purify water, navigate by stars. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could teach people to survive in hostile environments, but couldn't survive his own memories. On this particular February morning, with temperatures that could kill an exposed human in under an hour, Gray let Kodiak out for his routine patrol of the property perimeter. The dog moved with practiced efficiency despite his hearing loss, relying on scent and visual scanning to assess the 40-acre property. 20 minutes later, Kodiak scratched frantically at the door, not his normal request for entry, but the urgent, aggressive scratching that meant imminent threat or critical discovery. Gray recognized it immediately from deployment, the alert signal that preceded every IED detection, every enemy contact, every moment when Kodiak's senses detected something. Gray's couldn't. Gray opened the door, tactical assessment automatic despite 3 years of civilian life. Kodiak stood on the porch, his body language radiating urgency, but no aggression, no defensive posture. His mouth held something with impossible gentleness. A puppy. Gray's brain processed details with combat-trained speed. Mixed breed, possibly shepherd and husky, based on coat pattern and ear shape. Maybe 8 weeks old, small enough to fit in Gray's palm, covered in ice crystals, body rigid with cold, no visible breathing, no heartbeat detectable through Gray's hand against the tiny ribcage, clinically dead. Most people would have assumed the pup was beyond saving, frozen too long, brain damaged, a tragedy but inevitable given the temperatures. Gray's SEAL training kicked in before grief could. He knew cold water drowning protocol, had been certified in Arctic survival medicine, understood the mammalian dive reflex that could preserve brain function in freezing temperatures far longer than normal body temperature allowed. If this puppy had frozen recently enough, if the cold had put its body into protective hibernation rather than destructive death, there was a chance. Small, unlikely, but possible. Gray did something that shocked even himself. He began aggressive resuscitation protocol designed for hypothermic humans, adapted on the fly for a puppy that weighed less than 4 pounds. He stripped off his shirt despite the negative 18-degree air, placed the frozen puppy against his bare chest for core warming, the same technique used for battlefield hypothermia when no other heat source was available. He grabbed heated blankets from his emergency supplies, the kind designed for trauma victims, and wrapped both himself and the puppy. Controlled the warming rate carefully. Too fast would cause cardiac arrest, as cold blood from extremities flooded the warming heart. Gray performed modified CPR with 2 fingers, compressions so gentle they barely depressed the tiny chest, but calculated to maintain minimal circulation. He treated wounded teammates in freezing Afghan mountains, had performed emergency medicine under conditions where textbook protocols became improvisation. This was the same, just smaller, more fragile, seemingly more impossible. Kodiak lay pressed against Gray's back, adding his body heat to the rescue effort. The dog couldn't hear Gray's muttered encouragements or the puppy's absent heartbeat, but he understood on some level that his handler was fighting for life. For 40 minutes, Gray worked with the focused intensity of a combat medic, refusing to accept that something this small was beyond saving. Every compression, every warming adjustment, every assessment for cardiac rhythm. He couldn't save the children in Yemen, couldn't undo that shot, couldn't bring back that boy. But maybe, impossibly, he could save this. At 43 minutes, the puppy gasped. Ayo, tiny, desperate inhale that Gray felt against his chest more than heard. The sound was barely audible, just the faintest whisper of air moving through lungs that had been frozen solid. Gray continued warming protocols with meticulous precision. He administered sugar water with an eyedropper. IV glucose would be ideal, but he lacked the equipment, so oral supplementation would have to suffice. He monitored for cardiac irregularities using his fingers pressed to the puppy's femoral artery, counting the thread, already beats that gradually strengthened as core temperature rose. Over the next 6 hours, the puppy's core temperature climbed from 77 degrees Fahrenheit, technically incompatible with life, to 98 degrees. By evening, the pup was nursing warm broth from a bottle Gray had fashioned from medical supplies and a syringe. Tiny paws kneaded against Gray's chest. Dark eyes blinked with increasing awareness. Kodiak hadn't left the puppy's side for 6 hours, using his nose to gently nudge the pup whenever its breathing stuttered. The deaf dog couldn't hear the fragile respirations, but he could sense them somehow, the same way he'd sensed IEDs buried beneath Afghan dirt. Gray named the puppy Scout. It felt appropriate. A young dog who'd scouted too far from safety and nearly died for it, but who'd survived because of stubborn refusal to accept death as inevitable. A Scout slept against Gray's chest that night, wrapped in blankets with Kodiak providing warmth from behind. Gray felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the absence of nightmares. For the first time since Yemen, he slept through the night without seeing that boy's face. But morning brought questions. Where had Scout come from? Gray lived 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. There were no recent reports of lost dogs in the area. and the puppy's condition, frozen solid, alone in wilderness during lethal cold, suggested deliberate abandonment rather than accidental separation. Gray found evidence as soon as dawn provided enough light, tiny paw prints in the snow leading from the main road toward his property. Alongside them, boot prints. Adult male, size 11, based on the impression, depth and length. Deliberate stride, not the wandering gait of someone searching for a lost pet. Someone had walked this puppy into the wilderness and left it to die. Gray photographed the prints with the same documentation precision he'd used photographing enemy positions. Followed the trail through snow that revealed the full story. The boot prints led from a vehicle parked at the road's edge, walked deliberately into wilderness, then returned without the puppy. No searching, no hesitation. Purpose-driven disposal. 300 yards from where Kodiak had found Scout, Gray discovered something that made his blood run cold, despite 3 layers of winter clothing. 2 more puppies buried in a shallow snowbank. Dead for D. Days based on decomposition state. Same approximate age as Scout. Same mixed breeding. These weren't strays. This was evidence of systematic killing. Gray contacted the Flathead County Sheriff's Office from his satellite phone. Cell service didn't reach his remote property. Sheriff Tom Brennan arrived 2 hours later, his expression grim as Gray showed him the evidence. "This the puppy that was frozen?" Brennan asked, looking at Scout, who was wrapped in blankets inside the cabin, noticeably livelier than the previous day. "Yeah." Kodiak found him. Took 43 minutes of resuscitation, but he came back. Brennan's weathered face showed respect. That's combat medicine applied to a dog. Most people would have assumed he was gone. Most people didn't spend 15 years refusing to accept casualties as inevitable, Gray said quietly. Brennan pulled out his tablet, showing Gray a map with 17 red pins scattered across 3 counties. "We've had a pattern. 17 puppies found dead or dying over the past 4 months, all in remote locations, all during extreme cold snaps. We suspected abandonment, but had 0 leads. No witnesses, no vehicle descriptions, no commonalities between discovery locations." Gray studied the map with reconnaissance-trained eyes. The kill sites appeared random to civilian law enforcement, but to someone who'd spent 16 years analyzing terrain and enemy patterns, they formed a geographic pattern. "These aren't random," Gray said, pulling up a topographic overlay on Brennan's tablet. "Look at the distribution. They cluster around logging roads, hunting access points, and resource extraction sites. Someone's conducting regular wilderness activities, professional activities with permits and schedules." Brennan leaned closer. "Logging operations? Or hunting guides, backcountry rangers, survey crews, anyone with legitimate reason to be in remote areas during winter months?" Using SEAL reconnaissance methodology, Gray mapped the kill site locations against county permit databases Brennan accessed through his law enforcement credentials. One company appeared in all 3 disposal zones: Clearwater Logging Company, with active permits covering every area where puppies had been found. "That's correlation, not causation," Brennan cautioned. "It's a starting point," Gray countered. "Let me do reconnaissance." 2 days later, Gray visited Clearwater Logging under the guise of seeking employment. He'd researched the company. Family-owned, 3 generations, struggling financially due to declining timber prices and increased regulation. The kind of operation where cutting costs became survival necessity. The foreman, Dale Hutchins, was 48, overweight, with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been meaningfully challenged. He interviewed Gray in a cluttered office attached to the main workshop. "You got logging experience?" Hutchins asked. "Wilderness survival instructor. Former military. Know my way around equipment and remote operations." Hutchins seemed satisfied. As he showed Gray the facility, ostensibly to explain operations, Gray conducted tactical reconnaissance. His trained eyes catalogued details civilians would miss. Behind the main workshop, partially concealed by equipment storage, was a structure that shouldn't exist on logging property, a kennel facility. Not one or two dogs, dozens, German shepherds, huskies, mixed breeds, all in wire cages barely large enough for the animals to turn around. Malnourished, matted coats, water bowls frozen solid despite being indoors. Gray's expression remained neutral despite rage building in his chest. "You run a side business?" Hutchins laughed. "Designer dogs. Sell them online for $2,000 or $3,000 each. Profitable side hustle. Breed the ones with good markings. Sell the pups to idiots who want wolf dogs or working breeds without understanding what that means." "What about the ones that don't sell?" Gray asked carefully. Hutchins shrugged. "Market's fickle. Wrong coloring, health issues, timing problems. Sometimes they don't move. Can't afford to keep feeding dogs that aren't profitable. Euthanasia costs $200–300 per animal. That's overhead I don't need." Gray felt ice forming in his veins, the same cold clarity that preceded combat engagement. "So what do you do with them?" "Nature takes care of it," Hutchins said, with disturbing casualness. "I drive logging routes anyway. Drop the culls in remote areas during cold snaps. Freezing's humane. They just go to sleep. Free disposal. No paperwork, no vet bills." Gray pulled out his phone, showing Hutchins a photo of Scout. "Like this one?" Hutchins squinted at the image. "Yeah, that's one of mine. Wrong ear markings. Buyer wanted matching. Should have frozen a week ago." "How'd you get that photo?" "Because my dog found him, and I spent 43 minutes bringing him back from clinical death." Hutchins' expression shifted from casual to calculating. "So you're not here for a job. I'm here to suggest you contact authorities, shut down this operation, and turn yourself in before this gets worse." Hutchins laughed, genuine amusement that revealed how little threat he perceived. "Who's gonna believe a washed-up vet with PTSD over a businessman with county contracts? Those mutts would have died in shelters anyway. I'm just skipping the middleman. Cost-effective, eco-friendly disposal." Gray's voice remained level. "I'm suggesting you reconsider. And I'm suggesting you leave my property before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Gray pulled Scout from the carrier he'd brought. The puppy was thriving now, playful and alert. He'd brought Scout deliberately, knowing seeing the evidence alive might provoke reaction. Hutchins's face darkened. "This one should have stayed dead. Let me fix that." He reached toward Scout. Kodiak, who'd been sitting silently beside Gray, invisible due to his hearing loss preventing response to verbal cues, saw Hutchins's aggressive movement toward the puppy. The dog responded with professional aggression honed by 8 years of military training. Controlled bite to Hutchins' forearm, pressure calculated to neutralize threat without causing permanent damage. Gray didn't stop him. Instead, Gray used Hutchins' moment of shock to photograph everything. The kennel facility with malnourished breeding dogs, medical records showing systematic neglect spread across a desk, spreadsheets visible on Hutchins' computer detailing disposal of 143 puppies over 18 months. Gray's voice dropped to the ice-cold tone that had preceded every combat engagement of his career. You're right that I have PTSD. Wrong about the washed-up part. I'm a Navy SEAL who spent 16 years protecting people who can't protect themselves. Today, that includes dogs. He held up his phone, showing the live stream indicator. I've been broadcasting to Sheriff Brennan's direct line for the past 20 minutes. Every word you said about disposal, every photo of your operation, documented, transmitted, undeniable. Hutchins went pale. Sheriff Brennan's voice came through Gray's phone speaker. Mr. Hutchins, stay where you are. Deputies are 3 minutes out. You're under arrest for multiple counts of animal cruelty. Gray called Kodiak off with a hand signal. The dog released immediately, returning to Gray's side with perfect discipline. Hutchins clutched his bleeding forearm, his earlier arrogance replaced by the realization that his cost-effective disposal had just become evidence in a criminal case. The raid on Clearwater Logging's property took 6 hours and required 3 animal control trucks. 37 breeding dogs were recovered, German Shepherds, Huskies, Malamutes, various designer mixes, all in various states of neglect and malnutrition, some with untreated injuries, others with infections from living in filth. Dale Hutchins was arrested on 143 counts of animal cruelty, 1 for each puppy disposed of over 18 months. Additional charges followed: illegal breeding operation without proper licensing, environmental violations for improper disposal of animal remains, fraud for misrepresenting dog health to buyers, and tax evasion for unreported income. His business partner, who handled online sales, faced conspiracy charges. Clearwater Logging Company lost its county contracts within a week. No government entity wanted association with the case making national news. The company filed for bankruptcy 3 months later. Scout's survival became the symbol for the prosecution. Veterinary experts testified about Gray's resuscitation protocol. Cold water drowning techniques normally reserved for human hypothermia cases, adapted with remarkable medical precision for a 4-pound puppy. They explained that Gray's intervention represented a level of care that saved a life deemed clinically dead. Scout's recovery was complete. No neurological damage from the freezing incident, normal development, healthy weight gain. The puppy that should have died became the face of Montana's strengthened animal cruelty laws, which the legislature passed using Scout's case as justification. During Scout's recovery, Gray discovered something unexpected. Caring for a vulnerable creature who depended entirely on him quieted the nightmares about Yemen. He still saw that boy's face sometimes, still woke with the phantom sound of gunfire. But the guilt found company in purpose. He couldn't save those children, but he'd saved this puppy. And maybe that didn't balance the scales. Nothing ever would. But it gave meaning to the survival he hadn't asked for, but couldn't escape. Gray began fostering the dogs recovered from Hutchins's mill, using his 40-acre wilderness property as rehabilitation space. The remote cabin that had been isolation became sanctuary. The land that had been escape became purpose. Kodiak, the combat dog who'd struggled with retirement and hearing loss, became mentor for traumatized breeding dogs. He taught them that humans could be safe, that homes could be gentle, that the world held more than wire cages and frozen abandonment. 6 months later, Gray transformed his survival instruction business into dual operation: wilderness training for humans and combat dog rehabilitation for veterans. The model was simple. Veterans with PTSD worked alongside rescued dogs, both populations healing through structured activity and mutual support. Scout, now healthy and energetic at 7 months old, served as the program's mascot. The puppy who'd survived impossible odds proved that sometimes the most broken rescuers were exactly who the broken needed. The Flathead County Sheriff's Department invited Gray to train officers in cold weather rescue protocols, specifically the mammalian dive reflex techniques he'd used on Scout. Gray's protocol saved 3 human lives over the following winter: a child who'd fallen through ice, an elderly man collapsed in a snowbank, a hiker with severe hypothermia. Each time, Gray thought about the puppy Kodiak had brought home, frozen and lifeless, and the choice to try when trying seemed futile. On Scout's first birthday, Gray sat on his cabin porch with Kodiak on one side and Scout on the other, watching 17 adopted dogs play in the snow. Everyone recovered from Hutchins's mill, everyone thriving in carefully screened homes. A truck pulled up the long driveway. A veteran emerged, late 20s, hands shaking, eyes hollow with the particular emptiness Gray recognized from his own mirror. The man had called 3 days earlier about fostering one of the rehabilitated dogs. Gray met him at the porch. "You must be Davis." "Yes, sir. Army. 2 deployments. Got out 8 months ago. VA recommended I try this program. I don't know if I'm capable." Gray led him to the kennel area where a German Shepherd mix waited. The dog was 3 years old, recovered from Hutchins' breeding operation and carrying scars both visible and behavioral. "This is Ranger," Gray said quietly. "He's been through hell. Doesn't trust easy. Needs someone patient who understands that healing isn't linear. Think you can handle that?" Davis knelt slowly, his movements careful. Ranger watched from the back of his kennel, body language guarded. The dog had been beaten for barking, starved for not breeding on schedule, and disposed of in freezing wilderness when he finally became non-productive. Davis extended his hand, palm down, waiting. "Hey, Ranger, I'm Davis. I don't know what I'm doing either, but maybe we can figure it out together." Ranger took one tentative step forward, then another. His nose touched Davis's hand. Investigation, not affection yet, but contact, first step. Kodiak watched with the calm authority of a senior operator who understood his mission had evolved but never ended. Scout, playful and confident, bounded over to touch noses with Ranger, the puppy who'd survived impossible odds, encouraging another survivor to take the risk. Gray saw Davis's eyes well up as Ranger took another step closer, saw the veteran's hands steady as they found the dog's ears, saw 2 broken creatures beginning the tentative, terrifying work of healing together. "You're gonna do fine," Gray said. What shocked everyone wasn't just that Gray had resuscitated a frozen puppy using battlefield medicine adapted for a 4-pound animal. It was that he'd built an entire recovery operation on the principle that nothing was too broken to save, no one too damaged to heal, and the smallest life worth 43 minutes of refusal to quit. Scout's survival proved that sometimes the most important mission wasn't the one you trained for. It was the one that found you on a frozen February morning, carried in the gentle jaws of a dog who knew exactly what his handler needed. A reason to fight for something again. Gray looked at the 17 dogs playing in the snow, all saved from Hutchins's disposal operation. Looked at Davis and Ranger beginning their own journey. Looked at Scout, who bounded through snow with the pure joy of a creature who didn't remember being dead. He still saw that boy's face from Yemen sometimes, still carried guilt that would never fully leave. But now, When he woke at 3 a.m. with phantom gunfire echoing, Scout was there, warm and alive, and proof that some things could be saved if you refused to accept death as inevitable. Kodiak leaned against Gray's leg, deaf ears catching no sound but presence communicating everything that mattered. The dog who'd brought home a frozen puppy had given his handler back the one thing combat had taken, the belief that broken didn't mean finished. And sometimes that belief was enough to build an entire life around.